Our first story tonight is called The Laundry That Never Finished. In a quiet house, a dryer buzzed once, and then went quiet again. No one came to open it. Inside, the clothes lay in a warm pile, shirts wrapped around socks, a sweater balled up like a cat in sleep. The last bits of heat clung to them like a gentle memory. Nothing unfolded, nothing folded. One sock found its match in the tangle. A towel shifted slightly, then settled. In another room, somebody stirred, then decided against getting up. The dryer waited, humming nothing. The clothes waited too, soft, warm, and not in a hurry to be anything else. The window that collected moons. There once was an old window that faced east, and every night it caught a different moon. Not the real one, of course, but a reflection, bent and softened by the glass. Sometimes the moon looked like a silver coin, sometimes a cracked egg. Sometimes it didn't come at all, and the window simply waited, humming with quiet. No one opened that window anymore. It had been painted shut years ago, maybe on purpose, maybe not, but it didn't mind. It was still part of the room, still watching the sky. Over time, it forgot what things looked like in the day, but it remembered every moon it had ever seen, and it held them all, like light pressed gently into the dust. The basket that wasn't full or empty. Near the washer sat a plastic basket with a few clothes in it, not enough for a full load, not so little that it looked clean, just that in-between amount that made it feel like it had a job without doing much. The socks didn't match, the shirt wasn't folded, but nothing smelled, nothing was urgent. It had been like that for a while. No one rushed it. No one really noticed. It was just there, half finished, half forgotten, still doing fine. The pool in the forest that doesn't flow, fed by a trickle, maybe from underground, maybe from rain that fell days ago. The water never leaves it, not by force, just by disappearing slowly. It reflects the sky when trees allow it. Insects land there, sometimes rest. Nothing big drinks from it. The edge is lined with moss that never dries. There's no sound, no movement, not even from the wind. The pool doesn't shrink quickly, doesn't grow quickly. It's almost always the same. A surface without urgency, a depth that can't be measured without effort. But no one tries. The water stays, not because it's held, but because it's forgotten. The small patch of gravel beside the steps. Just to the right of the bottom step, there's a square of gravel. Maybe it was meant to catch water, or just to fill space. The stones are small and dull, mostly gray, some darker, a few lighter. They don't shift when walked on. They're too packed down for that now. A weed grows in one corner. No one pulls it. It doesn't grow fast. The border between the gravel and dirt is uneven, but no one smooths it. The gravel does its job by staying put. Rain lands softly. Nothing rolls. The stones don't shine. The teapot that waited for rain. There was a small teapot that lived on a windowsill above a sink. It wasn't used often, not since the kettle with buttons had taken over, but no one had the heart to move it, so it stayed there, listening to the faucet and waiting for something slower. When it rained, the drops would tap against the glass in irregular rhythms, and the teapot liked to pretend it was being filled again. It imagined steam and warmth and being cradled in hands that didn't mind pausing. When the rain stopped, it stayed exactly where it was, but for a little while, it felt useful again, even if only in its own mind. The hat that forgot its shape. There was a soft-brimmed hat that lived on the back of a wooden chair. It had been there so long that it no longer knew if it was meant to be worn or just draped. The crown had collapsed in on itself, and the brim folded like old fabric. It didn't fall, it just slouched comfortably, like it had melted into the idea of being a hat without having to prove it. The chair underneath never moved, and the sun that came through the window left a faded circle on the seat where the shadow of the hat had settled. The chair that faced the wrong direction. There was a chair in a sunroom that didn't face the window. It sat turned just slightly, as if someone had once meant to rearrange it, but stopped halfway and forgot. The legs left faint marks on the rug that never fully faded. The cushion hadn't been sat on in years, but it didn't seem unused. It just existed at an angle, not facing anything, not avoiding anything either. Sometimes light pooled across the back of it, sometimes it didn't. It was a chair, facing no one. The traffic light in the field. Out past the edge of a back road, a traffic light stood alone in a field. It wasn't connected to anything, no wires, no base, just there, upright, whole. It never changed color. The green stayed lit, flickering just slightly in the wind. No road led to it, no car ever passed. The grass had grown around it in a soft spiral, like the world had made space but no purpose. At night, the green light stayed on, not bright enough to guide, just bright enough to be noticed. The pine needle that stayed on the floor. Near the door, one pine needle had stayed behind after the tree was taken down. It wasn't swept up. It wasn't crushed. Just left resting against the baseboard, like it had chosen that spot. It didn't move when the door opened. It didn't catch the light, but it didn't gather dust either. It didn't get noticed often, but when it did, people left it alone. It felt like part of something, even if no one could say what. The rain that changed its mind. It started with a few drops, spaced out, hesitant. They darkened the pavement in small patches that never connected. The sky didn't fully commit. A breeze swept by, and the clouds shuffled a little, but nothing followed. A few more drops came, then none. The wet spots dried unevenly. The air stayed damp, but didn't cool. It had almost rained. That was all. The wind chime that didn't chime. Outside the window, a metal wind chime hung from a hook, but never made a sound. It didn't tangle or rust. The air just never moved it. Once, someone bumped it when closing the shutters. It rang once, softly, and then fell silent again. It caught sunlight beautifully and cast gentle shadows that moved slowly across the siding. No one took it down. No one waited for it to make noise. It didn't need to do anything to still be something. The log that didn't finish sinking. Near the edge of a slow creek, a fallen log rested half submerged in water. The bark had softened, and the one end had dipped slightly below the surface, but it never fully sank. Insects passed over it. Moss crept around the sides, but nothing tried to claim it. Sometimes ripples formed where the water met the wood, but they weren't caused by anything. They just happened. The log didn't resist the water, but it never disappeared into it either. The mist that didn't notice you were there. In a field just after dawn, a low mist settled at ankle height. It didn't rise, it didn't drift, it just lingered, uninterested in where it came from or where it would go. You could walk through it without changing it. It held no shape, no path, no scent. The grass underneath was dry. The sky above had already moved on, but the mist stayed, as if it had nothing else to do. The binder with just one page, a thick plastic binder, sat upright on a shelf, its spine cracked from years of being opened too wide. Inside was only one page, hole punched perfectly, no writing, no marks. The rings were slightly off, so the page never sat quite centered. Sometimes, if the window was open just right, the page would flutter a little, but not enough to lift. The binder didn't look incomplete. It just looked like it had done what it had came to do, and that was enough. The shelf didn't notice, and neither did the page. The pea that fell in the gap. Behind the narrow space between the counter and the oven, a single dried pea had come to rest. It wasn't visible unless you crouched down at an angle and looked with intent. It didn't roll, it didn't soften, it didn't rot. Just stayed dry and round, caught in the space where brooms didn't reach and no one checked twice. It once had been a part of something, but now it was only itself, and that was fine. The clock that wasn't bothered by time. A clock hung on the wall of a hallway where no one checked the time. Its hands still moved, but never seemed to land on anything meaningful. The tick was soft, almost shy. The numbers were slightly faded, not from age, but from being ignored. Once a week, maybe, someone glanced at it, then kept walking. It kept ticking anyway, not for schedule, just because it could. The salt shaker that was always nearly empty. On the kitchen table, the salt shaker never seemed full. Not empty, just mostly used. It was topped off occasionally, but no one ever filled it completely. There was always enough to use, but never enough to notice. The lid was slightly crooked, and the label had worn off. Still, everyone reached for it without looking. It had been part of the table setting for years, just passing salt without pride or complaint. No one knew where the matching pepper shaker went. The salt didn't seem to mind. The tree that was ready too early. There was a tree at the edge of a yard that started shedding leaves before the air had turned. Just a few at first, gold, then rust, settling at the base like it knew something the others didn't. The branches didn't creak, they didn't lift or droop, they just adjusted. The grass below stayed green, and the wind hadn't changed yet, but the tree let it go anyway, not with urgency, just because. The barn that never echoed. Out behind a long-forgotten field, there was a barn that still stood. The doors had warped slightly, and one of them leaned forward just a little too far to close again. Inside, the dust didn't float, it just hung there. Light came through one crack in the wall, wide enough to notice, but too thin to brighten anything. There were no animals, no tools, just the hollow scent of old wood and dry rope. It wasn't sacred, it was just there, left over. The juice ring under the fridge. Just beside the front leg of the fridge, A faint circle stained the tile. It was sticky once, probably from something sweet that spilled and had got cleaned up, just not completely. The ring didn't draw attention. It had dulled to the color of the floor over time. Not quite invisible, but not worth scrubbing. It caught a bit of light in the late morning, and then vanished again in shadow. No one remembered what had caused it. It was just there. Always had been. Probably always would be. The path that didn't lead anywhere new. There was a narrow dirt path worn into the grass behind a house, just wide enough for one person, though no one used it much anymore. It curved once to avoid a rock, then kept going in a straight line until it faded into nothing. There was no gate, no destination, no footprints fresh enough to read. It had probably been useful once, maybe even loved, but now it just existed quietly, like something forgotten but never erased, and that was just fine. The library card that stayed in the book. Inside a drawer, there was a book that no one had read in years. Tucked inside was a pale blue library card, bent slightly at one corner. The due date was too faded to read. The barcode had rubbed off from being handled too much. It wasn't wedged out like a bookmark, just resting loosely between the pages, like it didn't care if it stayed or slipped out. The book wasn't overdue. No one planned to return it, and the card didn't seem to mind. The wall that held nothing back. At the edge of a meadow, an old rock wall wound its way between trees. It didn't block anything. The stones were uneven, some stacked with care, others barely balanced. Moss had settled into the cracks. One stone had slipped down years ago and never moved again. It left a small gap that no animal used and no wind passed through. The wall didn't end, it just stopped somewhere, like it had been built until someone got tired. It wasn't a barrier, it was just there. The field that hummed sometimes. There was a patch of tall grass just beyond the fence that didn't belong to anyone. The wind passed through it like normal, and birds landed without concern. But once in a while, always in the late afternoon, it would hum, not loudly, not rhythmically, just a low sound, like a fridge too far away to unplug. No one checked on it, there were no wires, no buildings nearby. It just hummed briefly, then stopped. And when it stopped, it stayed silent for days. The grass never asked for an explanation, and neither did anyone else. The screen door that was never closed all the way. There was a screen door in a house near the coast that never clicked shut. It stayed open by a finger's width, just enough to let in a sliver of breeze and a bit of salt air. Sometimes it creaked when the wind nudged it, but not enough to make a sound worth fixing. It didn't swing, it didn't slam, it just hovered in its space, half in, half out. The house didn't seem to mind. The tape that held nothing. On the window frame in the hallway, a small piece of tape had once held up something, a sign maybe, or a decoration, but whatever it was, had long since come down. The tape had faded to a dull amber. Its edges curled slightly, but still clung to the wood. No one peeled it off. No one added anything back. It just stayed where it had always been, holding on to nothing at all. It didn't feel forgotten, just finished. The field that had forgotten the fence. There was a field at the edge of a neighborhood that had once had a fence around it, but the posts had fallen quietly, one by one. A few leaned into tall grass, others disappeared completely. The boundary was still visible if you knew where to look, but only in the way the grass changed color slightly along the line. No one rebuilt it, no one missed it. The field stayed where it was, so did the space the fence used to hold. The door that only closed most of the way. There was a door at the end of a narrow hallway that always stopped just short of shutting. It never slammed, never clicked, just leaned into the frame and stayed there. The air moved past it sometimes, nudging it inward or outward, but never enough to finish the job. There was no sound to it, no creak, no rattle, just a hush of wood and space. If you looked down the hallway, it always looked like someone had just left, but no one did. The door wasn't broken, it just didn't bother with endings. The mug that stayed warm a little too long. A ceramic mug sat on a small table near a curtained window. The tea inside had been steeped, maybe, but no one took a sip. It wasn't steaming anymore, but it hadn't gone cold either. The handle was turned slightly away, like someone meant to come back to it. The light moved across the table and touched the rim for a while, before drifting away again. It sat there all afternoon, holding on to a little warmth, long after it should have let go. The nail that wasn't holding anything. Above the stairwell, there was a small nail in the wall, slightly tilted, with the faint outline of where a frame used to hang. The paint was a little brighter behind it, shielded from time. No one remembered what used to be there. Maybe a calendar, maybe a small mirror. Now it was just a bare nail stuck in place, not in the way, not especially visible unless you looked at just the right angle. It didn't bend or rust. It didn't snag anything. It simply stayed. People passed it going up and down, never stopping to question it. It wasn't removed. It wasn't repurposed. It was still just there, doing its job, even if the job no longer existed. The slippers that knew the floor. There was a pair of slippers under a bench near the door. The insides were worn, slightly flattened. One leaned in more than the other, as if they'd always been a little off. The fabric had worn thin at the heel, but hadn't split yet. They didn't smell. They didn't ask for attention. They just knew where they belonged, and that was the floor. The fruit that wasn't picked. At the edge of a small orchard, there was a single apple hanging low on a branch. The others had been taken, gathered, eaten, or lost to time, but this one stayed. Not bruised, not perfect, just overlooked. The sun touched it in the late afternoon, making its skin look glossier than it was. A breeze moved the branch, but not enough to make it fall. It would stay there until it dropped, not because of decay or decision, but because gravity doing what it always does. And when it finally landed, no one would be around to hear it, and that would be okay. The smudge that stayed on the mirror. On the bathroom mirror, a faint smudge near the bottom corner, never quite wiped away. Not toothpaste, not fingerprints, just a soft blur that resisted every cloth and cleaner. It didn't block your reflection. It didn't draw your eye unless the light hit it at a right angle. Most people stop noticing after the first few days. It didn't grow or change. It didn't suggest anything was wrong. Just a small patch of haze on an otherwise clear pane. Sometimes people leaned closer without meaning to, then walked away. The mirror still reflected everything, but the smudge stayed exactly where it was, unbothered by its failure to disappear. The remote without a matching device. In a drawer full of odd chords and old keys sat a small black remote. No labels, no batteries, a single button worn slightly at the center. No one could remember what it belonged to. The last matching device was probably long gone, boxed or donated or thrown away years ago. Still, the remote stayed in the drawer, untouched but not discarded. Every time the drawer was opened, it shifted slightly, just a quiet little thud against a USB cable or half-used roll of tape. No one reached for it, but no one removed it either. It felt like it had earned its place, even if it didn't do anything anymore. The towel that was almost dry. There was a towel folded neatly on a hook behind the door. Not damp, not fresh, just holding a little warmth from something recent. It had dried most of the way, but hadn't finished the job. The corner was slightly tucked under, like it had tried to rest flat and changed its mind halfway. It didn't smell like detergent anymore, just fabric and quiet. It was the kind of towel you might forget about until you noticed it was still warm, the kind you don't remember using, but never think to move. No one needed it. It didn't need anyone either. It was still doing what it was supposed to do, even if that wasn't much. The soap that no longer had a shape. In a dish by the bathroom sink, the bar of soap had worn down to something no longer square, no longer round. It had a soft dent in the middle, where fingers always met it. It didn't slip anymore. It didn't lather much. It just sat there, holding the memory of being useful. No one replaced it. Not yet. It still worked. Mostly. The button that stayed in the drawer. At the back of a drawer sat a small black button, still in the clear pouch it came in, the kind that's sewn to the inside of a shirt or jacket, just in case. The garment was long gone, donated most likely, but the button had stayed. It shifted gently when the drawer opened and rolled just enough to make a sound against the pens and the batteries. No one used it, no one needed it, but it never got tossed. It wasn't taking up much space, and maybe one day it might match something again. The drain that watched the weather. At the edge of the sidewalk, just beneath the slope, a square drain rested where the water liked to go. Some days were dry and the drain saw nothing. Other days, the rain gathered and slid in easily, carrying a few leaves or petals along with it. A pebble sat nearby for most of a week and then vanished. No one stepped too close. No one gave it more than a glance. The drain didn't clog or shine. It didn't make much sound. It just waited where the water already knew to look. The rain barrel that never fills. It sits at the edge of the shed, beneath a crooked downspout. The barrel is blue, faded, and bowed slightly at the sides. The lid is gone. Rain does fall into it, but not enough, not fast. A leaf floats inside, some dirt at the bottom. The water never rises, never overflows, it never leaves. The downspout doesn't aim cleanly. It drips down the outside more often than not. The base of the barrel is ringed with moss. The ground around it is soft. It's not attached to anything. It doesn't feed a system. It doesn't water any plants. It just collects a little, then stops. The surface is dull. It smells faintly like metal. No one checks it, but it stays, just in case.